Good evening. Welcome to PoliticIt podcast. I'm Senator John Johnson. Today we have Matt Gwynn with us from District 6, Representative Matt Gwynn. And Matt, you're the Chief of Police in Roy, right?
I am.
So let's talk a little bit about you just to start with. I know we've had a show before and you're familiar with our audience, but let's talk just a little bit about you and what motivates you.
All right. So out of high school, I went in the Marine Corps, right? We've talked about how my brothers were raised in a house where both of our parents were addicts. So right out of high school, I went into the military, and I always wanted a career in law enforcement, but you can't do that till you're 21. And so I had 3 years to.
So you were 18 when you did that?
I was 18 right out of high school. Actually, I enlisted when I was 17.
Wow.
Yeah. So after graduation, I went to boot camp, did my 4 years. It kept me out of trouble so that when I came back, I didn't have a background to worry about, and then I could enter a career in law enforcement.
And that was kind of your goal going in to begin with?
It was, yeah.
What drew you to law enforcement? I mean, where did that come from?
So I don't know how much of it actually surrounded my parents, to be honest with you. But I was always... we live in Utah. We're always talking about how we're supposed to be helping people and, being there for others and being good neighbors and those kinds of things. And, I think I had a group of friends whose parents were amazing and wonderful and supportive, regardless of what we were necessarily going through, right? Their parents didn't always know. I never talked about it, but my friends had amazing parents. And so I think just kind of that mentality growing up, recognizing that what my parents were doing was wrong, but also recognizing that those are choices that I would get to make on my own, and I could either go the way they went or I can go a different route, coupled with, wanting to do something that's exciting, right? Now that I'm the chief, I don't really get to drive fast with lights and sirens anymore. I miss it.
You miss driving fast.
I miss driving fast with lights and sirens on. I miss getting in foot chases. Yeah, I do miss that. But there was a lot of that excitement. And when I was in the Marine Corps, we got to do some exciting things that were physically and mentally demanding, and law enforcement's no different. And so the military was a good segue, and it led to a very successful law enforcement career.
That's cool. So as you get older, though, you can't run quite as fast, and you can't.
Yeah, you can't run quite as fast. And quite honestly, our department has gone through some culture changes, some that are much needed. We've had some issues related to turnover, but I will say we've got a great group of guys that have the same tenacity, desire, and drive that I had when I was younger, and I love being in a position to make sure that they're given the tools and the flexibility and freedom to do their job as they see fit. And the support, right? And the support, mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's cool. So, given your background, that's kind of been a theme through your career in the legislature too, right?
It has, yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that. You're a committee. You're working on the law enforcement committee, right?
Yep. So I'm on the House Law Enforcement Criminal Justice Committee. And I'm the House Chair on the Criminal Justice Sub-Appropriations Committee, or Appropriations Subcommittee.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And what's that like? I mean, that's not the policy side, right?
No, it's not. It's not the policy side. And I actually spoke with Speaker Schultz about this because, I would love an opportunity to chair the House Criminal Justice Law Enforcement Committee, but I was very clear, and I know Ryan's watching this. I was very clear that if the opportunity came up, I would love that opportunity, but I would never ever go in and say, Ryan has to go.
Yeah.
I want to be. I was not going to do that to the speaker, and I certainly wasn't going to do it to Ryan. And so
you're talking about Representative
Wilcox, yes.
Yeah.
Representative Wilcox.
Yeah.
But so the speaker told me he was going to place me on the Appropriations Committee, and he said, look, he goes, I know that the policy side.
Now, you still serve on the policy side, too, right?
I'm still on the policy committee, yes. Yep. So, and that was the thing. He's like, I'm going to keep you on the standing committee. I think you're needed there. He goes, and I know that that the appropriation side isn't as appealing, but it is important because being in that space, you know where funding priorities need to be, and this is going to give you an opportunity to make sure some of that programming gets taken care of.
Well, and given your position too as a chief, you really understand the budgeting side of it, don't you? And understand where where money's needed and where.
Yeah, I will say though, like my small $8 million budget in the city is vastly different than the 11 or 12 or 13 billion it was that we had in the appropriations committee. Like it was challenging, and everybody has their wants or their needs, and trying to determine which programs are going to get funded and which aren't. That's a challenge.
What some people outside don't understand is we have a tremendous staff.
Yes.
In the legislature in Utah. Very seasoned people who know a lot about the budgeting process, who really understand where all the dollars are, where the money is, and that's tremendous help when you're in a position like yours, right?
It is tremendous help, and we would be lost without them. And I mean, to be honest, right, they're supposed to be objective stewards of the money, and they're very clear. Look, we found some cost savings that could be had here. We found some cost savings that could be had there. This is your decision to make. We were tasked to go look for this money. We found it, but whatever you do with it, that's a policy call. That's your wheelhouse, not ours. So they're very good at doing what they do, and they're very good at staying in their lane.
Yeah, I've appreciated that. I got put on the higher ed and the public ed appropriations committees this time. I wasn't on there before, and it's been really eye-opening.
Yeah. They have a challenging job, but I'm glad they're there because they can answer any question I have, pretty quickly.
Yeah, and chairing that committee is quite a big deal.
And I got to chair it with Senator Brammer this year, so that was.
Oh, that's right, because he was because he's moved over from the House to the Senate, and very conscientious person. I've really enjoyed having Senator Brady Brammer, in the Senate. I mean, he's a very, very intelligent, thoughtful legislator.
So you just used the word, well, you're going to have to.
Bright and thoughtful.
Conscientious.
Conscientious, yeah.
Sorry, Kevin.
No, that's fine.
Yes, he's very conscientious. When we first met to kind of talk about what we were going to do on this committee, he was very clear. He's like, look, I don't know anything about the public safety space. That's your deal. You run with it, right? And I was like, you know what? When it comes to the judiciary and the legal space, like that's your wheelhouse. You run with it. And so I think we went into that committee with that understanding, knowing what each other's strengths and weaknesses were, and we were able to balance that and play off of each other's strengths and weaknesses. And I'll be honest with you, I thought it was going to be a lot more challenging than it was. And we didn't even have any contention amongst the committee members the last day when we were prioritizing all the funding requests. I thought it went really, really smooth, and for our first time, I was actually impressed with how well things went this year.
That's cool. Well, of course you had some strong players on that committee too, that helped with that, right?
We do. Yeah, we do.
So let's move to some of your legislation.
Okay.
What are the things that you're most proud of?
Well, so I will say, this is my fifth session. Every bill that I submitted is either on the governor's desk or is on its way to the governor's desk. Whether or not it gets vetoed, we'll see. But and then every RFA I submitted was actually funded to some degree. And so this year I batted 1,000. I haven't had that experience. I don't know that I'll have that experience in the future, but I think for me,
so an RFA is a request for appropriation, right?
Yes.
So it's your way of asking for money for
Correct.
Specific things.
Yep. And so it doesn't happen every year. I've struggled with some legislation some years, but I will say this year was probably been my most successful year, legislating.
That's cool. So let's talk about some of those pieces of legislation. And some of them have been a multi-year task, right?
There were a couple that were multi-year, and that really was, we talked about sentencing, right, and coming off the back end of JRI, and was JRI successful? Was it not successful? Did we give it time?
So what is JRI?
So that's the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, right? That kind of really attacked sentencing, right, and looked at treatment, those kinds of things as a primary focus, as opposed to just sending people to prison, right?
Right.
Just like all public safety policy, it had its supporters, it had its detractors. But whether JRI was successful or not, I don't know that I was ever in a position to debate that. What I do know is that optically, I don't think it was well received by the majority of Utahns. And there was an appearance, whether justified or not, that criminals were not being held accountable and victims were being re-victimized by the system that's supposed to provide them justice.
And that had to be frustrating to law enforcement.
That is absolutely frustrating to law enforcement, right? Especially when we talk about juvenile justice reinvestment, right? The kids knew what they could and couldn't do, and they were always willing to step up to that line in the sand and, I'm going to say, taunt, more or less, because they knew what we could or couldn't do. And so my bills this year were to kind of attack the sentencing and the accountability portion. That was HB 78, right? And so what that did is it said, look, defendants who commit aggravated offenses, who maybe even complete aggravated offenses, if they plead to a second-degree attempted aggravated offense, then the presumption was now going to be prison. The judge wasn't going to be able to order them straight to probation. Negotiated with defense attorneys.
And what was that before?
So before, a judge, if someone pled down to a second-degree attempted aggravated offense, the judge could release them straight to probation. That was the presumption. So I negotiated with defense attorneys over the last couple of years and got them in a place where, they were concerned about those extenuating circumstances, which we can't predict, and that's a very valid argument.
Someone gets stuck into something that they may not have intended to do.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so we said, okay, we'll give an opportunity for judges to allow for those exceptions. And then what we said was, look, if a judge wants to sentence outside of the guidelines, then they can do that. But we're going to compel them to state on the record why. And that's something we didn't have before. Before, they could just go to probation and the judge wouldn't have to say anything. But now...
So you require the judges to kind of defend
their decision,
why they did what they did, right? And that defense would be those extenuating circumstances.
Those extenuating circumstances, right? And I don't think that's too much to ask a judge to do that. We ask that of our law enforcement officers. We ask that of prosecutors, right?
And that's more transparent to the public too, right?
More transparent, yeah. And it'll give us information later on when we've been talking about the judiciary and the role of the judiciary in Utah's politics recently, and retention elections. This is just another piece of information that the electorate or the public will get when judges are making decisions. Does the public agree with those decisions or those exceptions? And so they can then make those decisions and cast their ballot as they see fit when it comes to the judiciary.
Okay, so what does that mean to everyday Utahns when they hear about what you did in that bill?
So what that means is that the hope is, right, that if someone is going to commit an aggravated offense against somebody, whether it be assault, robbery, rape, that they are going to go to prison when they get convicted. And even if they plea to the lesser attempted as a second-degree felony, that they're still going to be going to prison and held accountable for what they did. That was the goal of 78. Because what we said prior to this policy is we have a list of offenses in the criminal code that says if you commit any of these offenses, the policy of the state of Utah is these are so egregious you're going to prison, period. But at the same time we said, but if you attempt to complete those offenses, so your intent was still there, but for some reason that you had, or for some circumstance that maybe you had no control over, such as maybe you're not a very good shot when you're trying to shoot somebody, or a doctor saves someone's life, or maybe someone interrupts you while you're in the middle of a sexual assault or a kidnapping.
Yeah, you grazed their ear because they turned their head, right?
Yeah, but for some reason, like if you complete this offense, you have to go to prison. But if you don't complete the offense, even though your intent was to complete the offense, that you just get to go to probation, that did not sit well with me. And so 78 sought to fix that problem.
Wow. And how long did that take? Just so people get some idea.
So
that was
a 2-year effort, and mostly because of funding. So a little known and interesting sidebar is that right now, aggravated offenses against persons are typically first-degree felonies. There is an exception right now, though, and that's aggravated child abuse, which was only a second. And so what we did is we said, look, if we're going to fix the sentencing problem that we have as it relates to aggravated offenses, we need to bump aggravated kidnapping aggravated child abuse up to a first-degree felony to give it parity with all the other aggravated offenses. And it turns out that was the most expensive component of this bill.
Because there's a lot of people that will go to prison and it costs money.
It costs money.
And I think one of the things people don't understand is when you try to pass legislation, we have attached to that legislation, there's a fiscal note which says this is what the fiscal impact on the budget is going to be. And then that has to be funded before the bill can pass.
Yes.
And I've gotten a lot of feedback from people that were kind of upset that we kind of put that requirement on people that run initiatives. And we basically just said, look, if you're going to run an initiative, there needs to be something that at least tells the public what the cost of this initiative is going to be if it passes.
Right.
Right. And that puts the same kind of constraint on citizens who want to pass laws as is put on the legislature.
Right. If I'm a Utahn and I'm about to vote on an initiative, I want to know if I'm actually going to be contributing to the bankruptcy of the state.
Or pay more taxes,
or pay more taxes, yeah. And neither of which I'm probably going to want, right? But I don't know what I don't know. So unless we compel them to provide that information, then are they actually a well-informed voter if they don't know what the cost is?
Well, and that's what puts the same discipline on us as lawmakers, right? Because we need to, we have a fiscal analyst that looks at the text of a bill and then says this is what it's going to cost. And that's why you're changing that law. The idea that more people would be in prison means there's a cost to the state of that, right?
Yeah.
And does the will of the legislature, is that will strong enough to say, yes, we're willing to pay that cost?
It's fascinating that you bring that up because I was informed early on that if there was going to be a problem with my bill, that I had 2 decisions I could make. The first one was I could just not move the bill forward any longer and say, well, we're not going to do it this year, right? Because of the cost. Or I could say, all right, well, the sentencing provision is important. We really need to move that through. But I would have had to have given up moving the aggravated child abuse to a second-degree felony in order to get the bill to move through without having to worry about funding. That did not sit well with me. And I wasn't willing to actually sacrifice one for the other. So we pushed it through, and we just waited to see what was going to happen the last night of the session, and it got funded. So
and it did get funded.
It did get funded.
Well, and see, that's a whole group of people now thinking about, what things we're going to have to push off the table.
Right.
Because there's a fixed amount of money, right?
Yes. Yep.
We basically know what the possible amount of money is. And given all the priorities that we had, is that one of those priorities?
And what are we willing to give up for what we're gaining, right? Because that money came from another program, right?
Right. Yeah, it has to come from somewhere. It's either an increase in the taxes, right? The budget somewhat increases every year because of, new growth in the economy and other things, right? People moving in, more a bigger tax base. But now we have to make decisions. How do we allocate the money that we have? And of course, we cut taxes again this year too. We gave teachers a raise, even in a budget year that was tight. But all of those things cost.
And that was another decision that we had to make, right? And I know that there was some concern, right? I had some concern, like, yes, I want to support a tax cut, but on an individual level, how impactful was that cut going to be versus what could we gain if that money was provided to other programs that did not get funded, right? And so I was constantly thinking about that, right? Tax cut for all Utahns, regardless of how small that may be to the individual person, or do we, and cutting programs, or do we just save that money and reallocate that money for existing programs so that they're not getting cut, right? Those are decisions that we're having to make. And I don't think people realize that we're making those decisions all of the time down there. And I don't think they also realize that we're cognizant of those decisions. And we know that if we're going to fund this, it has to come from this or this or this. Or
that's one of the things you learn pretty big when you're on an appropriations committee, especially
yes,
chairing it,
for
right?
Sure. Yeah, and you make a lot of people upset when they don't see their program on your priority list. And, to be fair, right, when we submit our priority list to EAC, the Executive Appropriations Committee, they may not agree with what we've done, and then they
have the ability
to move funding.
Well, and see, they have the ability to move funding not only within your domain, but across all the domains, right? Because there's a chair over each of these areas, like education, right, is divided into two appropriations committee, public ed and higher ed. Mm-hmm. Right? We're always making decisions about where we're going to move money between all of the possible places we could put it, right?
Right.
Last year I served on social services the year before, and I was on that committee for 4 years. And one of the things I learned is there's an unbelievable need across this whole state when it comes to social services. And those priorities are very, very hard to deal with.
And there's so many of them. I've never really felt intimidated down there when I've talked about stuff that I know about in my space. But I've gone into social services and I've presented RFAs, and that's intimidating, right? Last year was 4 minutes and a question or two. There was so many RFAs this year that when we went in, and I went in with who I was presenting with, we were told right out of the gate, 3 minutes, no questions. And you're staring at that timer while you're presenting.
Right.
Right? And in my committee, we didn't have that experience. People were able to come in, really spend as much time as they want. Sometimes we'd even get done early.
Right.
Social services,
that was an eye opener, because I went into the legislature with having just read Bastiat's book, right, and understanding kind of what Bastiat felt. That it's called the law, right, and so it's all about the proper role of government. What should government? Going into the legislature, I had a very, very tiny, limited view of what government should have a role in.
Right.
Right. And I think, having sat through that committee for 4 years, I realized there are tremendous needs. Mm-hmm. And and I discovered that I don't have a problem helping people who can't help themselves.
Right.
Right.
I think that is one of the roles. And the other interesting thing is we spend a lot of time kind of bad-mouthing government. And if you think about it, right, I teach this to my class up at Weber State every fall, is 95% of the things that it does, it actually does really, really well. And that gives us the ability to just focus on those very few things that we're frustrated with.
Right.
Right. But your mail's getting delivered, your streets are getting plowed. Oh, well, the snow got in my driveway. I'm upset about that. Okay, but once you got out of your driveway, it was free sailing to work, right?
Right.
And so I get hot water when I turn on my faucet in the morning. My alarm clock goes off because my phone was able to charge. Right? All these things. That
and you flip on your light switch and
instantly
the power comes
on. Yeah, and so all these things that government has a hand in, it actually does really, really well. We just have a tendency to focus on the things that bug us, I suppose.
Right.
So
interesting. We're going to take a break, and then we'll come right back.
Okay.
Tired of media bias? Frustrated by political noise? PoliticIt.com cuts through the clutter, giving you real facts, clear analysis, and unbiased insight on the issues that matter most. Stay informed, stay empowered. Whether it's elections, policy changes, or breaking news, we've got you covered. No spin, no agendas, just truth you can trust. Visit PoliticIt.com today, because informed citizens shape the future. PoliticIt.com, where politics meets clarity.
Welcome back to PoliticIt. We've got Matt Gwynn with us, Representative District 6. Thank you. So we talked about some of your legislation. I want to hear about the fentanyl thing.
Fentanyl, yeah, HB 78. So we have a problem with fentanyl in the state of Utah. And
People don't realize how big a problem we have.
it's huge. I don't know that I realized how big it was, and that's in my space. And I just happened to be talking to someone last session. I just got an itch last legislative session. I was thinking, what can we do about fentanyl? And I wasn't naive to believe that we're ever going to stop it from coming into Utah, but what could we do to maybe disrupt it, or what can we do to force dealers to break it down into smaller packages, if you will, right? And so I thought, well, I'm wondering how successful I would be if I made distribution of fentanyl a first-degree felony. And it turns out I was asking people kind of tongue-in-cheek last session, and they're like, I love it. Let's do it. No, I love it. Do it, right? And so I said, okay, we're going to do it. So we worked on it over the interim, and we had people.
So when you talk about working on it over the interim, what does that mean for people outside of our space?
So after legislative session, we get like a 1 or 2 month break, right? And then we get into what's called this interim period, which is the time between the end of this session and the beginning of next session. And this is the time where lawmakers are really putting work into their bills that they're planning on sponsoring in the next session, or they're evaluating bills to determine whether or not they're going to be successful or their likelihood of success.
And this is a very deep dive.
This is a very deep dive, and they're working with all the stakeholders.
So these are big projects.
Big projects, yep. We take on studies, and so we use this time between the end of the previous session and the beginning of the next session, called interim, where we really attack these policies. And so what I did over the interim, prior to the 2025 session, I brought in Department of Public Safety. I brought in SIAC, which is the Intelligence Center for the state of Utah. I brought in Defense Counsel. So I had defense attorneys in the room. I brought in other attorneys. I brought in the Attorney General's office, and we actually had a discussion. And the fascinating thing is even the Defense Counsel was supportive of what we were doing. For them, the issue wasn't fentanyl and holding people accountable. For them, the issue was getting the policy right, so we weren't going after addicts and unnecessarily putting the end user in prison, which was never the goal of this bill. I've been very clear in the beginning, we're going after the trafficker, right? So because in a way those people are victims, the people that you're talking about right there, and that the Defense Counsel is worried about. Correct. And we can't put them all in prison. We don't have the space, and I don't think that's appropriate for the end user, right? My parents had an addiction. They weren't traffickers. They shouldn't be treated the same. Right. And so I was just kind of dumbfounded by how supportive people were in the very beginning. Yeah, let's make it a first-degree felony. And Defense Counsel.
Jess was in here, the Commissioner of Public Safety, Anderson.
Oh yeah, very supportive.
And he talked about fentanyl in that podcast.
Well, we were able to get an RFA for him, which is going to fund 5 additional troopers and 5 additional dogs. That's going to be their only focus, is trafficking.
Wow.
So
these troopers, and so they have a pretty good idea about where this is happening. And
oh yeah, no, we know where it's happening. We know. So here's what we know. We know that the fentanyl coming into Utah is coming into Utah. Utah is the end destination. It is not being used to be trafficked. We're not being used as a highway into Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado. The fentanyl that's coming into Utah is for Utahns. We're the end destination. In 2023, I believe, they seized over 2 million tablets, right? Right now, the DEA estimates that 70% of the fentanyl coming into Utah would be lethal if someone who wasn't a user ingested it, right? So when you see a trunk, or when they seize fentanyl from a trunk of a car and they have 100,000 tablets there, right, that can kill, 70,000 people. Like, that's huge, right? And so I've kind of tried to message this as combating terrorism in a way, because the amount of carnage and mass casualty effects that fentanyl has. It's now over half of our It's now involved in over half of our overdose deaths. While the rest of the nation sees overdose deaths decline, we're actually seeing ours go up
In Utah.
in Utah. And so, this is just one of the ways, right? There's a variety of things that we have to do to combat this epidemic, and that's treatment, right? Because the reality of it is that it's coming into Utah because we have a demand for it, right? We have a demand problem. So clearly we have to address that, because as long as there's demand here, it's going to continue to come here. And so this bill was just one leg of that stool. But the message we're trying to send is, if you're going to traffic fentanyl in Utah, you're going to prison, and you're going for at least 5 years.
And that's basically what this bill outlined.
That's what the bill outlines, yeah. And quite the biggest point of contention, the biggest thing we tried to solve was where we were going to set the amount. What was the amount we were going to set the line at?
Now, how do you come up with that line?
So what we did is we reached out to SIAC, right? What is the average number of tablets, or what's the average weight of fentanyl coming into Utah? We looked at that.
So of people that were stopped, right?
That were stopped.
And the drugs were seized.
Yeah. And so what we came up
Because you really wanted to divide the traffickers from
yes, from the end user,
from the victims,
yeah,
right?
And so what does that look like? Well, it depends on who you ask. So we got everybody in the room, and we worked with the SIAC, and we worked with DP.
So what is SIAC?
I forget the name of the acronym. I'm going to get it wrong. It's the State Intelligence Analysis Center, I believe.
Okay.
So it's operated by DPS.
That's the Department of Public Safety.
And so we looked at traffic.
That's one of the things that comes under the commissioner, right?
Correct. Yeah. And it's actually down at Slick, I believe.
Salt Lake Community College.
John wants me to stop using the acronym.
No, the acronyms are fine. I just want to make sure people are understanding.
No, I need to be cognizant of that. I appreciate it. So, anyway.
Hey, I was a tech professor. That's all we talked about was acronyms that nobody can understand, right? So
and we do it to this day in my line of work. All the jargon. Stop using the jargon. I will stop using the jargon.
No, it's fine. I just.
But we looked at the history of fentanyl trafficking over the last couple of years in Utah, and as we were debating the amounts, we saw a clear, bright line right at about 100 grams, right, which is about 1,000 tablets, 1,000 dosage units. That's about 100 grams, and so we evaluated.
So one tablet could kill somebody, though, right?
There's a 70% likelihood, if they're not a tolerant user, that it would kill them.
So you mentioned this idea of a tolerant user. What does that really mean? What does that imply?
Yeah, so a tolerant user is someone who's actually built up resilience to an opiate specifically, right? We know that with alcoholism, people who are alcoholics have built up a tolerancy to alcohol. They have to ingest or consume much more alcohol than someone who doesn't use to get to a point where they appear intoxicated or inebriated, right? And so opiates are kind of the same way. If I take an opiate, and
the more you use it, the more you really need to get the same.
Correct, right? And so, typically you'll get prescribed an opiate for like 3 days, right? And you'll even notice by the end of that 3-day regimen that it's not as effective. And so you need to take more, right? So you take more, and then over time you realize that's not as effective.
So fentanyl is an opiate, but it's not an actual, it's a lab created opiate.
Yeah, fentanyl is a synthetic opiate. And quite honestly, they're actually changing the structure of fentanyl. And so if I remember my napkin math correctly, fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine. And we are now seeing carfentanil come into Utah. Well, carfentanil is 1,000 times more potent than than fentanyl or morphine. I don't remember. But what I can tell you is a 2 milligram dose of fentanyl can be fatal to an adult, right? A 0.02 milligram dose of carfentanil can be fatal to an adult. I think it was it's 0.2 milligrams, 0.02 micrograms.
Wow.
So carfentanil is used to provide anesthesia to large animals like elephants.
Wow.
And, we're ingesting it.
And this is this trafficking of fentanyl is a very orchestrated thing coming out of China, doesn't it?
So the precursors come out of China. They go into Mexico. They're either pressed or they're mixed into the powder form in Mexico, and then they're shipped into the United States.
Well, amazing.
And so what's happening is some of these pills that are pressed are getting to a home where there might be a tolerant user, right? Someone who's built up a tolerance. A child may get a hold of that tablet and ingest it, and it could kill them.
Wow.
Right? And
that's our kids.
Toddlers have ingested these in Utah. We had one in the Vernal area that was airlifted to primaries. She ingested one tablet. She stopped breathing for a, quote, significant period of time, and they had to put her on a naloxone drip, a Narcan drip.
In order to keep her alive, right? Anyway, so we looked at the number of seizures, we looked at this weight, and we found that on average, we would have about 44 cases a year in Utah that this would apply to. And so that was the number that we were able to collectively settle on. That's kind of cool how those negotiations go on behind the scenes. People want to make sure that we're going after the dealers,
Right.
the big traffickers, right?
Right.
Not some user that was selling stuff because they were trying to feed their own habit.
Yes. Yep. And so once defense counsel was supportive of that, we got the bill written. And as I worked with other lawmakers, whether or not we landed in the right place at 100 grams and approximately 44 cases a year, I don't know. But as far as winning the policy, that vote got out of the House and the Senate not one oppositional vote, not one.
Wow. That doesn't happen a lot.
That does not happen a lot, especially when we're talking about criminal justice policy, and especially when we're talking about drug policy.
Because there's quite a large contingent that does not want to send victims to prison.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that they're innocent victims, but they are victims.
They are victims to a degree, right? I mean, they made the conscious decision to ingest at some point, right? And then they became addicted, and now they're having to combat that addiction. And we were very clear. We don't want to go after those individuals. They're the ones that.
That's not the people we want in prison.
That is also, you're correct. Those aren't the people we want in prison, right? They're taking up bed space for those more violent people who should be in prison. And I look at the distribution and trafficking of fentanyl as a violent offense. It's killing people. It's killing hundreds of people a year. And there have been attempts to go after drug dealers through drug-induced homicide legislation, and it's failed. So this was the one way we were able to get sentencing that's commensurate with killing somebody without actually having to prove they've killed somebody. And that was the goal of the policy.
Interesting. So is that on the governor's desk yet?
That's on the governor's desk, and I have received no indication to believe he's going to veto it. The governor's office has been very supportive of that.
Well, especially if it goes through with no opposition at all, right? Yeah. I mean, there may be people outside that are opposed to it, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, people that are trafficking drugs to our kids, right?
Yeah.
But interesting. So, any parting thoughts? I mean, we're about out of time.
I don't know that I have any parting. I ended this session on a high. I think I had a great year. I need to be more cognizant of that next year because not everybody has that opportunity. I'm grateful that I was given that opportunity. So I think, I'm probably going to have a couple bills, but I don't know that they're going to be anything significant unless something
not like these are.
This.
I mean, you talked about two very significant victories for Michigan.
I think they are very significant. So I really want to focus my time next year on maybe fine-tuning criminal justice policy or helping others with their significant bills and let someone else kind of maybe get their legislative high next year.
Well, Chief, we appreciate you coming in. It's always nice to hear about your world.
No, thanks, John.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
We'll see you guys next week.